Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this masterclass about how to reconnect when you're feeling lonely. I just wanted to say before the masterclass starts that at the end of the masterclass, we're going to be having a Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up as we're going through the masterclass, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can also use the questions function at the bar right below the chat. And then when you put in a question in the questions tab, people can also vote for the question. So this way we can also see which questions rank higher. And for today's masterclass, your psychologists and speakers are Joachim and Paul. And now I pass it on to Joachim. Have a great masterclass.
Thanks for that introduction, Gabby, and also on my behalf, a very warm welcome to today's masterclass. I think it's an important topic to be talking about loneliness, especially in this time, right? The holidays bring forward this image, perhaps perpetuated by all the Hallmark movies of family and togetherness and coziness and all sitting together. But I think we'd have to be real and realize that for a lot of people, this isn't what this time is all about. For a lot of people, it's also the confrontation of what they're perhaps missing in their own lives. And even apart from that, I think for loneliness is something that a vast majority of people experience from time to time, and therefore, I think an important topic to check in on that. What is loneliness, and how do we reconnect when we're feeling that way? Um, as we're seeing, it's not just me. I also brought Paul with me. He's gonna come in halfway through today and talk to you about his topics too. Today's content is going to be about, of course, we're going to have to start by defining loneliness for a bit. We're going to be doing some myth busters here. So, for some of the causes of loneliness, we'll get into the three different types of loneliness. Um, Three is the magic number here today because we're also going to go to the three different pitfalls that we're seeing when we are feeling lonely. And of course, how to then reconnect and what to do with it to make that a bit more tangible. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them either in the question box down here below or in the chat, which we just opened up here. Feel free to engage in any sort of way. And perhaps also as a starter here, let's not just define it from our end, but I'm also curious about your definition. What is loneliness to the people listening here? What does it mean to you, and how does it impact you if you ever feel that? Before we only so we don't only give our interpretation of loneliness, but I'm also very curious about what you think loneliness is. Thanks. And I'm already seeing the first reactions pop up. Gwendolyn is saying here that feeling left out. Yeah, I think a very recognizable one there. Let's check in. Some empty, cold, disconnected, being on his own. Yeah, the disconnection is really coming forward here. Feeling excluded. Trust is an issue there as well. I'm seeing that with Florencia. Thanks for that. Not understand. Nice. Bored as well. Definitely something that can be associated with loneliness here. Sometimes it's just a perception Toby brings in, which is great because that's exactly what it is. A lack of physical, mental affection. I would add emotional to that. Yeah. All right, great. As this continues on, I think it's already interesting to see how other people perceive loneliness as well. Oh, thanks for sharing that as well, Joe. Not having anybody to talk about your problems is definitely one of the types of loneliness that we'll address in this masterclass as well. Um, Thanks for this great response. There's so many people that are responding here. That's great. That's exactly what we like to see here. Um, what we're seeing when we're looking into loneliness, I think it's good to state that this is of course a very 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 common thing, right? About 33% of people worldwide are suffering from loneliness. In varying degrees, of course, but I think it's very much part of the human experience to be lonely at times. But it's subjective, it's perception, it's a feeling. It's not a fact. It's not something that is permanently so. Um, but usually, loneliness is very much connected to a lack of close and emotional connection to others. It's a very personal experience. So for some, it's that big need for more meaningful relationships or large social networks, and that may differ per person. Um, I think we can state that loneliness has an evolutionary purpose, um, as I think most of the things that we're encountering when it comes to human experience or behavior, right? And I think in this case, it's the important one there is that it is unpleasant to feel lonely, and therefore making the chance that we are reaching out to other people a bit bigger, which is I think what the purpose is, to be able to reconnect. Um, and it's being for our physical system, it can even be experienced fairly similar to physical pain when we're looking at sort of neurological studies into what lonely people are experiencing, and it is very close to actual, well, actual I think it's both pain, but to let's call that physical pain. So there's a very strong drive there to force people to actually reconnect. But sadly, of course, it doesn't always work that way. I think if we're combining that with a fairly big stigma on feeling lonely, right? A lot of people are experiencing this as sort of a personal failure, where we, us being such social creatures, the inability to reconnect, to reach out, to do these things is sometimes experienced as something that we should feel guilt or shame about, which is, I think, one of the biggest factors in us not reaching out. Um, and I think that, like that, there's a lot of myths and stigma going around. Um, so for that, we'd like to see how this works with the group that's listening to us here today. So we wanted to do a little myth or fact on loneliness, and for that we brought three different polls. So in a few seconds, you're going to see the first poll pop up, um, which is on the cause for loneliness, and the first poll today is going to be about that loneliness is fixed by having a relationship. That's the cure for loneliness. And I am very curious how the listeners here are thinking about that. You should see that pop up at this point. We check if it pops up. Oh, I also see people responded to as a myth in the chat. There should be a poll pop up coming up here that you could vote on. I see Diogo saying partly and Sylvain saying myth. All right, it's in the polls tab. All right. Ah, there it is. Oh, it's funny that this also pops up for me at this point. All right. And as we can see that for the vast majority of the people, they are seeing this as a myth. It is, so that may mean that it is in fact not fixed by having a relationship. Um, Total myth, yes. I think I'm gonna go agree with the people that are already putting in some nuances in the chat right here. Of course, it's not completely fixed by having a relationship, but it's definitely something that could help, and also something that can't help, which we'll reflect back on when it comes to some of the different types of loneliness we can experience. Because yes, you can be very lonely in a relationship as well. Um, let's let's see. That's an interesting one from Sandra. Depends on the type of relationship. Yeah, also very true. Um, let's go to the next one in the meantime. Because one of the other ones that we're seeing is being isolated leads to more loneliness. So if we're isolated, we have more loneliness. Is that again a myth or an absolute fact? Let's see what the results are on that. All right, going to the polls tab, seeing a lot come in here. All right, very good. I'm seeing up to 76, something like that. Yeah, 76% of all of you stating that is indeed a fact, and I would say um, I would um, I would agree on that. Already seeing some people, which I'm going to reflect on in a minute, when it comes to what kind of personality you have. I would say that as a general rule, when we are being isolated, having no contact with other people whatsoever, that the chance of loneliness uh, in a negative sense really increases. So that's definitely something that we're finding. Usually, it's not there. There's some form of isolation, and again, we'll get back to that in a minute. What kind of forms there are. Um, it's cool. I'm already seeing that question pop up. Does loneliness affect introverts less? Please put that back in the end as well. For now, I'm going to say there's some effects, but they're not the biggest one. And there's a little bridge to the very next poll. Here it is. Some people are just more likely to get lonely than others. I think this really reflects on some of the things popping up. Is that myth or fact? And again, checking your responses here. Some people are just more likely to get lonely than others. We're seeing a fairly staggering 92%, 79 of you stating this as a fact. Um, and in this case, I would say I would agree. There's definitely some personalities that are more likely to get there. The interesting thing there is that the biggest personality factor that we're seeing in science coming up isn't necessarily introversion versus extroversion, because I think there's a very common misconception that introverted are don't want to connect to other people. It's just a different type of connection and intensity that they're looking for. What we are seeing is that people that are more inclined um, to uh, to score high on a skill that's called neuroticism, which is a tendency to overthink and to worry and to also feel more gloomy at times. That they do have a higher tendency of actually feeling more lonely in a negative sense. Um, and when it comes to when you are feeling lonely in contact with other people, then something else may be going on, which I think I'll address to next. Some of the polls we've had at this point. All right, so what we're seeing in loneliness, to sum up this part here, there's definitely something happening in relationships, right? So a complete lack of any social relationships in the broadest sense of the word is definitely something that contributes heavily to loneliness. Circumstances can have an influence. Think for instance about if you don't have the financial means to go out often, or that's causing you to overwork many times, and this of course also has a negative impact on your ability to do something about your loneliness. And then, as I addressed, uh, there's a personality aspect, mostly the neuroticism part, that um, may influence that, though it isn't necessarily the introversion part. I want to think drive that home today. If you feel that you're more inclined to be introverted, that does not mean that that you automatically are more likely to feel lonely. There's stuff to be need. Um, yeah, which I think brings us to the three types of loneliness that we can discern there. And of course, there are many more that we can dive into, but I think these are three of the bigger ones that pop up in the research that we're doing here. Um, and I think primarily there, and this is also what I'm seeing reflected back in the chat here for a bit, is emotional loneliness. And I was contemplating on saying something about this or not, but this is actually one of the ones that I'm experiencing presently, as well as I'm going through a bit of a bit. I'm going through a breakup at this point, and I think it is emotional loneliness when it's sort of the lack of actual emotional connection to somebody. It's not necessarily contact with anybody, but it's that deeper bond that we're trying to get, that these romantic relationships are often giving us. um, so it is that it's these things that loneliness that comes up when we're going through breakups, or we lost somebody, or we're going through these more difficult times and we're feeling unable to connect to other people. um, and these things can occur straight up in the middle of these uh, in crowds as well, right? We can have all these nice friends and social connections around us and still feel emotionally lonely at times. And also thank you for these response, that's really heartwarming. um, And I think apart from that, that's the more classical loneliness is the social loneliness that we see second here. This is actually the isolation part, really not being in contact with other people on any level, which is really a driving force between going from a bit of loneliness to really darker feelings and more negative thoughts. And then a final form is that you can have these emotional connections, you can have these social connections, and still feel lonely when it's more of an existential loneliness. It's the when these bigger questions of life pop up, right? What are we doing here? Why am I floating in this very big rock in space? What's the point of all of it? Which is also something that we would describe as feeling lonely, that sort of feeling lonely in a universe almost. These three different types, I think, always are interconnected and working together, working together to cause these patterns that we're trying to break through here. And I think on these patterns, I'd at this point very much like to call forward my colleague Paul here to talk about the three pitfalls and patterns that we're seeing here. Take it away, Paul.
Yes, thank you, Jochen, for that nice beginning of the masterclass, and also thanks to everyone in the chat for your active participation and the support and love towards Jochen right there. It was really nice to see. I'm going to talk about three pitfalls of loneliness, and every human being is unique, and there are many ways that we as humans can try to deal with negative feelings or negative thoughts that can lead to loneliness. So three pitfalls does not cover it all, but these three are very common. That's why we chose to talk about these specific three. And the first one is what we call the social distance cycle. And it's a cycle. So what it means is that it empowers itself, and it can keep on going unless you break that cycle. And it often starts with being unable to connect or feeling a certain distance from people. We've just talked and looked at some of the causes for loneliness. And then once it arises, we can feel a certain distance. And that can lead to not being able to either want to or maybe even dare to meet with people because of said distance. However, avoiding people means that there's not an opportunity for new connections to arise or for existing connections to increase in either emotional or social aspects. This in turn will lead to feeling more distant from people. And that's when it becomes full circle, because that distance, that feeling of not being able to connect with people again starts or like emphasizes, becomes stronger, leading to again not wanting to and not daring to meet people, etc., etc. So this is one of the pitfalls. It's very hard to get out to. Obviously, knowing it and seeing it and understanding it is one. How to break that cycle we'll get into later. But first, let's have a look at the other two circles. And I see Toby asking a question about seeing the presentation. I believe yes, so, and I think Gabby is going to respond on the technical side. I'm going to go ahead and continue with the second pitfall, which is called the all is well pitfall. And it has to do with vulnerability. In our society, in our upbringings, and in many cultures across the globe, being vulnerable, sadly, still is seen as being weak. And we as human beings don't want to be seen as a burden to others. So in a way, not being vulnerable is socially more accepted. However, it's exactly that vulnerability that leads to meaningful connection, especially when we're talking about experiencing emotional loneliness. It often has to do with not having that meaningful connection, and it can start with vulnerability. We did add a little asterisk there, because with all things in life, there needs to be a healthy balance. There needs to be space for all parties involved to share their vulnerabilities. In addition, and I think what happened just now with Jochen's story and the response, the beautiful response by the chat, it shows that, well, when you do tell people about what's happening, about your feelings of loneliness, they know that it's happening and they can help you. And yeah, the other way around, when you don't tell people you are feeling lonely, how will they know when or how to help you? So that's the all is well pitfall, the trying to appear strong. when vulnerability is that which can lead to emotional connection. And the third common pitfall is the negative thinking cycle. As we said earlier on, loneliness is a feeling, and a feeling is subjective. And through our life, through our experiences, we learn how to think in a certain way. And the quality of our thoughts can be more positive or be more negative. And sometimes, not to our own fault, we experience things that make us have more negative thought patterns. We then have the tendency to interpret neutral or maybe even positive situations negatively. For example, not getting a text message in the weekend can lead to the conclusion, you see, people don't like me. And ironically, painfully, these negative self-evaluations also influence how you are to others. For example, you might feel less connected and you can end up in a social distance cycle, making it less likely for you to connect. This can only emphasize the negative thoughts you have about yourself. In addition, also good to mention that this negative thinking also applies not only to yourself, not only to you see people don't like me, but it can also apply to others. You can interpret certain responses by others in a more negative way and associate that with their personality. Again, also only strengthening the chance of ending up in a social distance cycle. I see a response by Jean on, if you do tell and they do not respond in a helpful manner, you can feel extra lonely. That's very true. In a bit, I'm going to talk about ways to reconnect, and we're also again going to talk about vulnerability, and I'll dive into that a little bit more, but that is definitely true. Let's do that. Let's move on to the breaking the cycle part. So how to reconnect. What are the things that we can do when we are feeling lonely? The first one is focus on how to break a social distance cycle. So when we are feeling lonely, thus not being able to connect, thus not going out or putting in the effort to meet people and keeping the cycle intact, we're going to break that cycle by getting in touch. It's obviously easier said than done, but we do want to challenge you to, for example, gather contacts you haven't spoken to in a while, or make a short list of those that you will see or reconnect with soon, and simply send them a message. Ask them how they are doing, and ask them first before discussing what has been bothering you. Another way to get more connections or improve the connections that you do already have is by offering help. Showing vulnerability, which we'll get into later, is one way of connecting, but also seeing other people's vulnerabilities and offering to help can increase a sense of connection. You can, for example, babysit children when friends or neighbors have just gotten kids, or you can help around the house. And also, don't be afraid to ask for help yourself. Indicate where you could use some extra hands. And then the power of vulnerability. Again, emphasizing seeing what just happened, where Jochem showed his vulnerability and the response was beautiful. But I also want to jump back a little bit to what Jean or Jean, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, talked about. Because if you do tell and they do not respond, if you are vulnerable and they do not respond in a helpful or nice manner, you can feel extra lonely. And that is exactly why vulnerability is so hard, because it can hurt you. We sadly cannot control how other people will respond. And in singular instances, people can respond in a way that is hurtful and can make you feel extra lonely. However, what we're seeing in the research, but also through experiences from ourselves and from clients, is that on a larger scale, vulnerability will lead to that emotional connection. And if you do tell and they do not respond in a helpful manner, you know that you now have a certain idea of how someone responds to you when you are vulnerable. What often happens when we don't know is we push our pain, we push our loneliness, we push our negative feelings aside, and we still try to uphold a sense of connection, even though that person in the end might not even respond to you in a nice and helpful manner when you are vulnerable. It's a painful process in the short term, but in the long term, good for connection. So we want to challenge you for the coming days to show vulnerability to 3 people you know. And this can be something large or something small. For example, you can, after a presentation or giving a masterclass, tell your coworker afterwards, wow, I was pretty nervous just now. Or it can be something bigger. You can maybe connect with an old friend or a family member and talk about feelings of loneliness. But yeah, we want to challenge you to give it a try. And it's like John or Jean said, can end up in being disappointed. However, showing vulnerability to multiple people, you will probably experience that one or more will be vulnerable back and will lead to connection. Then the final one, and this is the one related to the negative thinking, to the negative thought patterns. It's dealing with negative thinking. We often, some are already conscious of their negative thoughts, but for some, it's not that clear. And we want to ask you if this is the way of breaking this cycle of trying to reconnect, you want to give it a try. We ask you to write down your thoughts to get an overview of how you were talking to yourself. You could do that, for example, through a diary. You can have a moment every evening where you write down certain moments of the day where you felt lonely or where you felt sad, and you think back, in what way did I think or talk to myself? And then we're going to practice the friend perspective, or as I like to call it, becoming your own cheerleader. You basically ask yourself, how would I talk to a friend dealing with this situation? You will notice that it's often way nicer than you are talking to yourself right now. And then you try to say those things to yourself, which is hard and uncomfortable because you're not used to it. But we definitely want to challenge you to try it. If critique is stronger, and if you feel that you need a little bit more self-compassion, within that diary, when you write down and what you felt and what you thought, we also ask you to write down one thing that you're proud of with regards to yourself. So you can add a little self-compassion part to that diary. This is a way to build up self-compassion. It will feel forced in the beginning. However, the longer you do it, the more that you work on it, the more automatic it will go. In addition, there's also a lot of research done on mindfulness to train what we call flexible attention. What often happens with the negative thinking is that we get a sort of focus, a sense of control on the thinking, and we try to fight it. Sometimes it's nice to get out of that by putting your attention on something else. Mindfulness is a way to train that, to train the shifting of the attention. Let's see. Sabina, I see, wrote down, I do not like journaling, but it was recommended to me and it really helped me to visualize the negative thoughts and rationalize them. They still come by, but I can keep them under control. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Sabina, and for highlighting exactly what it is. It it is not something that is necessarily nice, especially in the beginning, but it can really help. The final point with regards to dealing with negative thinking, but it actually applies to all of the challenges that we just gave you with regards to how to deal, how to reconnect. It can be hard to do by yourself. A psychologist can help you dive into the topic deeper, maybe look at the causes for why the negative thought patterns are there and how to take the first small step in the right direction. Do not hesitate to contact a psychologist at Open Up or at another place. We just hope that if you feel the need to discuss this with someone else, definitely please do so. I'm gonna have a quick look at the chat before I go on to the next slide. Also, Roxandra highlighting how journaling got her to start giving herself a pat on the back. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And yes, it is a difficult habit, but definitely worth it. Here we have a quick QR code for if you do indeed feel that you could maybe want to talk about this topic more in depth, or if you feel that you, for example, with regards to the journaling, need a psychologist or a couple of sessions to really make sure that you do it. Again, don't hesitate to book a free introductory session with one of our psychologists. In short, loneliness is a feeling. It can be caused by relationships, other external circumstances, our own personal reaction to it all, or a combination of the above. It comes in different forms and shapes, the emotional, social, and existential loneliness that Joachim described. And loneliness often arises due to the following pitfalls. We just discussed the social distance cycle, the all is well pitfall, and the negative thought patterns. They can be battled by strengthening existing relationships, showing vulnerability, and dealing with your negative thinking. And know that loneliness is painful and can be hard to challenge yourself. Do not hesitate to contact a psychologist for help. Joachim also put the link in the chat, and something I forgot to do, but I will do once we start with questions, is also share a TED Talk by Brené Brown. She dedicated her life to research on vulnerability. If you find that an interesting topic, I can wholeheartedly agree. Watching that TED Talk, it's inspiring. All right, and then I think it's time for us to dive into the Q&A.
Yes, I just posted the link to the Brené Brown TED Talk in the chat for everyone. It's a really great great video. Yes, we've had quite a few great questions come in. Thank you so much for being so interactive. So we're gonna start off with the Q&A, and the first question is, I can make logical plans to avoid loneliness when I'm calm. For example, reach out to people. But then while I feel lonely, I get emotionally overloaded and I'm not in the mental space to think of these logical solutions. What can I do to generally deal better with being emotionally overloaded?
Yeah, I think this is a really great one. I saw that comment there too. I think part of the solution there is in your answer, to not make these plans to reconnect when we're already feeling lonely, because it becomes, due to the pitfall that we were describing, it becomes harder to do it in that time. And I think it's the message that we didn't want to bring across is that loneliness is something that is bad to experience. It's very much part of the human experience, and it's okay to feel lonely at times. What I think we want to do is not wait until we feel an excess of loneliness that's keeping us from doing the things that we actually want to be doing. So I think it is creating space to experience whatever it is you're experiencing, emotionally speaking, at times, to then, from that point on, um, have that need for social contact and start working on it at that time, not when you're actually feeling so miserable, because it gets so, so much harder. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Paul.
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I do think also with regards to feeling emotionally overwhelmed, I might sound like a broken record, but journaling can really help. Writing about these emotions. What am I feeling? What are my thoughts with regards to these emotions? Obviously, it's not a silver bullet, and it doesn't solve it all, but it can release some of that tension. And seeing that cycle, seeing what's happening inside of you,
Yeah.
can really help calm down or ease those emotions, which is needed for you to then start reconnecting.
Yeah, it's not necessarily about not feeling negative feelings. It's about being able to carry that. And I think that's a very worthwhile practice. In fact, most of the time, the real suffering is in all the things we're doing to not feel lonely, instead of just accepting that it's part of life as well.
Yeah. Another question from David. As a man, I feel a lot of social pressure not to open up to those around me, or at least too quickly. Do you have any advice for how to manage these pre-existing beliefs that men should not be emotionally intimate to friends? Wow, that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, very great question. Recognizable. And I think for me, what helped is to start opening up, which feels like a huge, big thing. So to make it smaller. Start with showing vulnerability with friends on a very small scale. It could be saying that you were nervous talking to someone, or that you had a year review for work and that you were actually kind of scared. It might be that they at first make fun of it because, yes, in some circles that it's seen as a weakness. But what you will notice is that even those responses that often come from a place of insecurity, they won't hurt you that much. You'll survive, and you will have shared some vulnerability, and it will give space for others to do the same. So I think, yeah, in short, start small, and also experience how the negative feedback that we're so scared for is not that scary at all.
Yeah, that's really great. I can only agree with that. I think I'd like to add on to that is that you can also, which to me felt safer to do when I was looking at one of my own personal relationships, when I started noticing I don't actually feel very safe here to open up, and I started having a conversation about that. We're only talking about cars and sports here, and actually not doing that great. Can I talk about that? Do you feel that this is a topic? And this other person I discovered had a similar feeling. So we're stuck in this sort of a broken record ourselves, in which we just talked about the same things, and then only to discover that we both had the same underlying needs. We just needed to begin. So I think that's the add-on there. To the only way we're going to get there is at some point we're going to have to take that first step, and it's hard, but it's so worth it.
There's a question from Judith. How can I cope with loneliness, especially being super social and having great friends on my side still makes me feel lonely as I am single?
I think it is that it is a sense of gratitude which we can only express there, and if it is the type of loneliness that you feel stems from not having a relationship, it may be worthwhile to investigate with yourself a little bit. Is it then the sort of deeper social emotional connection that you're craving for, which is something that luckily you don't actually need a romantic relationship for to um, experience. And that's again I think that connects back to the answer we were just giving. And at the other hand, well, perhaps this is starting to do things in your environment which increase the likelihood of somebody who might be matching with you.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. I struggle with addictive behavior. and some groups of friends promote this behavior, and I'm simultaneously don't want to isolate myself, but also don't want to go to them as I know I'll likely be using. What would be good things to try in this space?
You want to go, Paul, or should I?
Yeah, you go first.
All right.
I want to think about this for a bit.
Yeah. Take the time as well. Well, first off, that's really tough because a large part of addiction is connected to sort of availability to the substance itself. There with the existing group of friends, I think there is an importance there of sort of coming out to maybe at least one or two of them, perhaps in a separate occasion to sort of talk about that. So this is tough, and can we build up? Because it becomes a central part of some friend groups, right? That they're always drunk or always using when they're together, and there's of course other possibilities there as well. So it may be good to start building social interaction around other events as well, some activities you can do together. And apart from that, it may be a signal to also start working on social contact in other groups, because the risk there to intertwine social connection and addiction is I think present. I think something that we can take very seriously, and is I can only imagine is really tough for you as well. But definitely something I think that needs to be addressed and something you can work with. Yeah.
And something you don't have to do by yourself. I'm very well aware that if I say if you feel that it's becoming more out of control, reach out for addiction specialized like substance abuse specialized mental health care. I'm aware their waiting lists are excruciatingly long, but it might definitely still be worth it to get on one of those lists. Addiction is hard to get out of. It's very much okay to reach out for help.
Nice. Yeah.
Also, I saw a response in the chat with regards to the prejudice we recently just discussed with regards to men, and it's a very good point by Nicola that the prejudice also exists for women. It's a slightly different dynamic, but yes, it's very important that us talking about the male prejudice shouldn't exclude the female side of things. So thank you for adding that, Nicola.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and really opening up. And there will be a replay available of this masterclass on our website for on-demand spaces, or also on our YouTube. So in case you'd like to rewatch it, it'll always be there. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Jochem and Paul for this wonderful session. And we wish you a very great weekend. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks for participating. Bye.